about black everything. Everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here at the Franklin Humanities Institute, and we are joined today by friend and colleague and noted scholar, Jennifer C. Nash, who's the Jean Fox Obar Women's Studies Distinguished Professor, Professor in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, and Director of the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies program. She's the author of 3 books, all classics: The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, Black Feminism Reimagined, and she's joining us today to talk about her most recent book, Birthing Black Mothers, all published by Duke University Press. Of Birthing Black Mothers, our friend Dorothy Roberts writes, viewing Black motherhood as a trending political side, Jennifer C. Nash boldly pushes Black feminists to reflect critically on their own embrace of crisis rhetoric that casts Black maternal bodies as mere symbols of state violence marked by suffering, trauma, and grief. While powerfully arguing we risk reproducing Black mothers as problems in need of intervention and relying on low-wage Black birth workers to save them, Nash points to ways we can theorize new forms of Black maternal freedom that refuse confinement to a marketed crisis frame. How are you doing today, Professor Nash?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Let's talk a little bit about your body of work generally. You have made pointed interventions in Black feminist thought and Black studies. Some of it emboldened by your own training in law. How do you see yourself, right? If you would describe yourself in the field, right? How do you describe yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think you're right that so much of the way that I'm trained to think and write comes from having gone to law school, which I think is in part permission to make arguments and to cause trouble, right? I think lawyers like to think about the parameters of any term, how elastic terms are, what its boundaries are. So retrospectively, like thinking back on my 3 books, I think they're all interested in what Black women mean for various actors, what Black women mean for Black feminists, what Black women mean for the state, what Black women mean for the hospital, what Black women mean to the university. I think that's a kind of through line that animates the books. But I think at every step of the way, I've been trying to unsettle a set of romances about Black feminism in particular. And I think this romance has really proliferated since 2016, that Black feminism is always radical, always anti-institutional, always fugitive. I'm actually really interested in the traditions of Black feminist thought that are enamored of the state, right? Like thinking of someone like Patricia Williams, that are liberal, that wield power and that like to wield power, right? Like I'm interested not in thinking about those traditions to criticize them, but actually in thinking about how they're part of the Black feminist canon. So I see ultimately my interest is in really thinking capaciously about what Black feminism is and what it can do.
Sylvia.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Not so well? Let me see. If I bring this in closer, is that better? Not so much? I am delighted to welcome you all here today for this Book Watch event.
At times, Black mothers are described as representing anticipated loss, as preparing themselves and their children for anti-Black trauma that is to unfold in the future. Other times, Black mothers are culturally invoked to make visible the trauma of losing a child already, and thus become synonymous with grief that has already unfolded. With the new cultural visibility of long-standing Black maternal health disparities, birthing Black mothers are now imagined, in perhaps the most literal way, to be vessels of Black life. In this moment, anti-Black death is understood to take the form not only of the police officer's fist, baton, or chokehold, but also the form of the unwanted C-section, the racialized disrespect and indifference that mark so many Black women's experiences of institutionalized medicine, and ongoing disregard for Black women's pain.
You open Birthing Black Mothers, positioning yourself as a daughter and a mother.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the genesis of this book for you.
Sure. So the book, so I always joke that if you told me I was going to write a book about motherhood 10 years ago, I would have said, nothing's more boring, give me a break. and then I was pregnant with my daughter. And I became really interested in how I was understood as a patient, like what it meant to be a Black woman patient. And so the book really started with the first chapter, which is about breastfeeding. I had made a decision very early on that I didn't want to breastfeed. And at every step of the way, that decision was met with aggression. And I was really interested in what that was about. I also made the decision to deliver in what's called a baby-friendly hospital, which is a hospital that really advocates for breastfeeding. And I would say, though they wouldn't say, criminalizes formula feeding, I would say that. And so I was really interested in what it meant to be a Black woman patient who had made a decision that was thought to be uninformed or uneducated. So at every step of the way, I would have midwives and nurses and doctors ask me questions like, do you understand the health benefits you're giving up for yourself and your baby? Do you need more information about breastfeeding? Can you tell me why you've made this decision? And so I was constructed as a bad patient, and I was really interested in that construction. So that's how the project was sort of born.
I mean, are you sitting up there in the hospital, like laying out your arguments in your head?
I was sitting in the hospital exhausted, but
I mean, because I can imagine. I mean, because you
Right.
strike me as having one of those minds that never turns off.
I remember, I don't know if you're like this, Marcus. Sometimes I think in the middle of something, the way that I make sense of it is like, oh, one day I'll write about this.
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
only way that I can make sense of what's
Yeah.
going on, or like I can approach this as an ethnographer, right? And so I think that I was trying to make sense of what I was seeing and what I was experiencing. And then I wrote the rest of the book in the first 2 years of my daughter's life. And I think the early years of having a child are so intense and draining and demanding and filled with lots of complicated maternal feelings that I wanted to think about and write about.
Yeah, you mentioned how you felt an urgency to do the book. Right, obviously for your mother, for your daughter, but you also wanted to make sure that your mother
Yeah, absolutely.
had a hold of the book.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, my work that I'm doing now is very much about my mother-in-law, which is something that I've written about for public audiences. And so, a lot of people talk about the sandwich generation, right? What it's like to have small kids
and elderly parents.
And elderly parents. And certainly where I am in my life. And so it was important to me that the book made it into the world in a time that my mom could recognize it as something that I had written, and that she could recognize that I had written about her in the book. That felt really important to me. And it's funny, I remember when going back to the breastfeeding chapter, I called her to say, getting all this pressure to breastfeed. And my mom said, what are you talking about? And I said, it's so contested. And she said, I had you in 1980, nobody cared. And it was one of those moments where I thought like, oh, right, I'm also a historical subject, right? Like I'm in the midst of a moment that I don't realize I'm in the midst of. And having her remind me that in 1980, the decision to not breastfeed your child was not a controversial one. In fact, my mom was like, all of my feminist friends didn't breastfeed because it liberated you, it allowed you to go back to work sooner, right? So for me, that was a really important conversation to understand like the temporality of the kind of fervor around breastfeeding.
And I think, to the point that you make in the book, you joke that, half joking really, that, black breast milk has become liquid gold, right? It's positive dealing with all of what ails,
Yes, right.
young black children, right? And we can have a whole conversation about the market of formula, how much it costs, the way they set it up to be criminalized because it's behind cages and all those kinds of things, right? And I think in this moment, right, we forget the choices that previous generations of women made not to breastfeed because it gave them flexibility and mobility that the culture wasn't ready to assist them with, right? We could argue the culture is more accepting, right? Allows for spaces, right? The fact that there are birthing rooms and things like that, lactating rooms and spaces. But 30 years ago, there was none of that support base.
Of course. And I think the other piece that I don't write about much in the book is that most of the breastfeeding that happens in the US is actually breast pumping, right? And so we talk about breastfeeding as this amazing practice of attachment.
I know
but it's mostly women attached to machines, right? And when you talk to folks about pumping, especially when they pump at work in the lactation rooms that you describe, many folks will say, it's super stressful to be in the middle of a meeting and to be like, excuse me, I've got to go, and to pick up your gizmo and to like go to the room, right? I mean, I remember interviewing someone whose company made what she called a feminist breast pump, and she described how sexualized she felt every time she had to grab her machine and go to another room because all of her colleagues were thinking about her breasts, right? And so how even though this room was supposed to be about feminist freedom, it never really felt that free to her. So yeah, I do think it's interesting just to think about the kind of the generational shifts and how we've thought about breastfeeding and how feminism is such a complicated thing, right? Like on the one hand, feminism is the thing that said, we don't need to breastfeed, our freedom will be when we can work, right? And now we have an iteration of feminism that says, well, if we breastfeed, we're free from the market, right? Our bodies can produce everything we need. And we're never free from the market. That's its own romance. And so I think it's interesting how you can really see the ways that feminism gets put to use to do
because
something.
you still got to buy these expensive breast pumps, right?
Yeah, the pillow
and the bottles, the store,
of course.
Packs of frozen.
Yes.
Yeah, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the great, interventions you make in this book is to really discuss how birthing Black mothers, Black motherhood, now has a certain kind of political currency that it hadn't had before, right? And it really meant in previous generations certain notions of pathology, right? Pathology exists in the Black community because of the quote-unquote failure of the Black mother, right? And now it's shifted from this pathology to a site of crisis.
Yeah.
And this crisis has now taken on all kinds of interesting political meanings. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that really struck me, and I sort of marked this in the book as a kind of 2016 as a turning moment, is that you have politicians start to talk about this crisis that they're seeing, right? And for them, the crisis is Black mothers are dying at disproportionately high rates. Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris has a moment where she talks about this when she was still running for president. And Black mothers become a kind of like talking point, particularly for the Democratic Party. Black mothers are these figures who are thought to live in death worlds, who are tragic. And the idea is that the state needs to intervene in some way. And so part of my interest was in understanding, as you were saying, how did we get from a moment where Black women are these bodies that we should pity, who require support and maybe education when it comes to breastfeeding, right? Maybe they need compassion, rather than these figures of like thinking about the Moynihan Report era, right, of pathology and deviance. So I wanted to think about that shift and also track this kind of Black Lives Matter shift where you have Black mothers garnering political power and political currency by talking about the fact that they kind of stand as representatives of Black life, right? That they sort of speak on behalf of their dead children, oftentimes their dead sons, right? That they speak on behalf of those boys. And I'm thinking about when the Mothers of the Movement appear on stage with Hillary Clinton at the Democratic National Convention to sort of confer their morality on her candidacy.
Hillary Clinton has the compassion and understanding to support grieving mothers. She has the courage to lead the fight for common sense gun legislation.
I'm thinking about when folks like Leslie McSpadden run for political office and their credential is like, I am a mother, right? Yeah. People say to her, what do you know about governing Ferguson? And she's like, who would know better than I would? My son died here. So this really interesting way that Black mother becomes a way of speaking about grief, sorrow, tragedy. And I think since I wrote the book, part of what's been so interesting is you have this class of experts that have emerged in the last 5 or 6 years, right? So you have all these degree programs about Black maternal health, training, certificates, more folks becoming doulas, more folks becoming midwives, more awareness of the crisis. And at the same time, when you see data from the CDC, the numbers aren't changing at all. Like the disparity between Black maternal outcomes and white maternal outcomes remains just as stark as it was before this expert class emerged. But you have spaces like the university and the state investing and kind of producing these experts.
No, I mean, it's interesting because you bookend birthing Black mothers with stories of 2 different Black women.
Yeah.
One who falls down a flight of stairs but saves her baby. Another one who is criminalized, right, for not having a place to sit, right, waiting for care. And there's a lot of energy publicly that goes around. They become, called celebrities, right, in that context, right? But none of that conversation or language actually addresses the conditions that led them to be in that space in the first place, right?
Absolutely.
In the first case, the invisibility, right? No one willing to help this woman go down the steps with her child, right? Or no one in the hospital, in the clinic, being able to say, maybe you should sit down, right? And just treating her as someone, who was of no value within that space. What does that say to you about where we actually are in conversations about Black mothers?
Yeah, I mean, I think...
Because I think you also balance that with, in many ways, the only reason why we talk about these things to the extent that we do now is because of Beyonce and Serena.
Right, exactly, exactly. I mean, I think with Malaysia Goodson, the woman who fell down the stairs in the New York City subway.
Tonight, a family overwhelmed with grief. Struggling to understand how their loved one died in a New York City subway last night. Police say 22-year-old Malaysia Goodson plunged down a flight of stairs in a Manhattan subway station, holding a stroller with her 1-year-old daughter inside. Remarkably, the baby was not hurt.
She becomes visible only in death, right? I mean, there are literally people who walk past her and don't help her carry her stroller down the stairs. And then when she dies, the story is, what an amazing mother. She manages to fall in such a way that her baby lives and she dies.
And she laid there for some time.
Yes,
right. Unconscious.
Exactly. And then there are protests. I have pictures in the book of folks holding up, signs with her name. We will never forget Malaysia Goodson. So it's interesting to me how she becomes visible in death, and how that's some of what I learned in writing this book, right? To what you were saying, the conditions that she was experiencing every day are not of interest until her dead body can be mobilized for political reasons. I talk very briefly about a woman in my book named Shaija Semple who died at Woodhull Medical Center in Brooklyn.
She's 26 years old. How does your heart stop at 26?
Friends and family grieving and broken over the sudden death of Shaija Washington. The young mom-to-be appearing healthy and excited in the final days of her pregnancy. But last week, after entering Woodhull Hospital here in Brooklyn, Shaija died. It was after an epidural during an emergency C-section, and no one seems to know why.
A doctor botched her epidural. He had botched other women's epidurals. Those women had also died. Woodhull is a public hospital that serves mostly Black and brown women. And once Shaija Semple dies, her name is everywhere. There's a mural in Brooklyn with her face on it. 2 years later, the New York Times does a story about her and her child. They do a photo shoot of them, right? And I'm thinking to myself, there's no conversation about the conditions that persist at Woodhull Medical Center that are about the inadequate care that Black and brown women, particularly poor Black and brown women, receive. Systemic, right? No conversation about the stratified nature of public and private hospitals in the city. No conversation about the kind of maternal care deserts that continue to exist, even in big cities like New York. So we become obsessed with trotting out these dead Black women and making them causes, heroic causes, rather than, as you were saying, thinking about the structural conditions that produced the lives that they were living. So.
My daughter just had a grandchild. She chose to go to a birthing center. And I remember, for me, being a little confused about what that was, the choices, working with a midwife. You talked to almost 30 doulas in Chicago. For those who aren't familiar with this new language around birthing, talk a little bit about what distinguishes a doula from, say, a midwife, and why Black doulas have become such a thing.
So I think doulas are such interesting figures. They are companions. They are not medical experts, right? And they will all tell you they do not provide medical advice. They're there to accompany a birthing person through labor and delivery. And ideally, what a doula does is they meet you while you're pregnant before you go into labor, and you have a conversation. They get to know you. They hear what kind of birth you want to have, what's important to you. And usually they particularly want to hear if you say something like, under no conditions do I want an epidural. They're like, got it. Under no conditions do you want an epidural. They're there when you deliver. And I think importantly, in those moments when you are exhausted and your body feels like it's at the end of the road, they'll say to you, I want to remind you what you said at your dining room table. You said, under no conditions do you want an epidural, right? And I think, and then they're there ideally after you have the baby, right? Most of the doulas who I interviewed will come 2 to 3 days after, when new parents are at their most exhausted, and they'll provide postpartum care. They'll talk about breastfeeding if folks are breastfeeding, but also they'll help process the birth, because I think for most people, birth unfolds in a way that's not what you expected. And for many people, what happened in the delivery room is upsetting. And so having a chance to talk about it, re-narrate it, think about it becomes really important. As for why Black doulas have become these kind of highly visible figures, I think a few things have happened. I think as there's become more conversation about Black maternal health, more and more Black mothers feel like when we move into medicalized spaces, we have to be armed and prepared. And doulas, particularly Black doulas, I think increasingly describe themselves as bodyguards. So like, I will be in the delivery room with you so that when the OB pushes medicine on you, I can step in, I can advocate for you. And so I think more and more Black mothers feel like having an advocate is important. And more doulas want to fill that role. And I think the state has increasingly become interested in doulas because there's this sense that they don't necessarily have to be trained in a certain way, right? There's a political mandate for Black doulas because they're doing kind of Black life work. And so the state sees it as a low-cost way to easily mobilize a group of folks who will do the intensely demanding work of attending births, oftentimes for free. Many of my interlocutors said, I will do this work for free. And none of them had enough money to be doing anything for free, but they felt it as a cause. So I think that's why they've become so highly visible. And I think another piece is, and so interesting here at Duke, like increasingly doula training organizations will tap college students, and college campuses is a place to begin training doulas. So I'm teaching a class on motherhood this semester, and half of my students are saying, oh, did you see the signs about the doula training? I'm going to train to become a doula. So it's interesting to think about college campuses as this place that doula education is really proliferating.
Right, at the same time that they're recruiting, through ROTC.
Absolutely.
It's an interesting
Absolutely.
dynamic.
Yeah.
You offer a really innovative read, I think, of Black Lives Matter, and the way that Black Lives Matter utilize Black mothers, which I have not seen in many readings of Black Lives Matter. Talk about where Black Lives Matter fits into this conversation.
Yeah, so as I was saying, I really see this as a book for me that took shape thinking about the post-2016 landscape. Right. I really wanted to think about how, despite the narrative that Black Lives Matter is a movement that's centered on men and boys, which I think is not untrue, I wanted to think about Black mothers as the centerpiece of this movement and think about how Black life had become synonymous with Black mothers, so that if we think about breastfeeding, that the act of feeding your child and making choices about how you feed your child is thought to be not just about filling your child's stomach, but doing something to affirm Black life. Or when I think about the doulas with whom I spoke, some of them who felt like having an unmedicated birth was really important. And it was important because it showed you something about what your body can do. And that was important because Black mothers need to know that, because they need to know their strength, because look at the world that we're in. So how you deliver your baby became a larger kind of political lesson about your capacity to endure. So I think it's really interesting how the work of maintaining and preserving Black life has kind of fallen to Black women, and how you see Black mothers, and thinking again of the mothers of the movement as this kind of very visible face of the campaign to preserve Black life. When I talked to doulas, it was really interesting to hear them think about how what happens in the delivery room for them felt really aligned with so many other political issues. So like my interlocutors would move back and forth. They were all in Chicago, between talking about, what happens in delivery rooms on the south side of Chicago and gun violence. One of my interlocutors said it's important for doulas to know how to deal with gun wounds and how to deliver a baby, and doing both as a response to an emergency. So it was interesting to think about how capacious this idea of being in the service of life was for them. Like they saw themselves as life workers. And they saw Black life as always vulnerable. And so thus Black mothers are at the front lines of protecting life. Yeah.
We do this work, and I think we assume that we're doing important interventions into Black life, right? Whether it's crisis, celebratory, what have you. But then we take our work out into the world, and we're primarily talking to white colleagues. Have you had opportunities to discuss your work with Black audiences or Black folks who are doing the work in assisting, Black mothers?
Yeah, I have, and it's been really interesting to see what those conversations are like. I was giving a talk 2 weeks ago at Old Dominion University, and pretty much everyone in the room was Black. And the primary question that folks wanted to talk about was home birth. And they wanted to know, as one student said to me, don't you think all Black women should birth at home? What do you think? And I was like, okay, it's a really complicated question, and I understand where it's coming from, and I want to think through it. But so many of them had heard just in the air from each other, from popular culture. Hospitals are places where you go to die. Hospitals kill Black women. And so thus it goes to reason that you should give birth at home. And so it's been interesting to see how that question has become a really important one, like the where of birth. You mentioned the birth center before. A lot of Black folks have asked me, like, what about the birth center? Is that better than the hospital? What do you think about that? So I think those questions are very much on people's minds. The question of who should you bring with you into the delivery room, I think matters to Black audiences in a different way. I was thinking of one of my doula interlocutors who described to me how a lot of her women of color clients like to bring people in the plural with them. They would say, I want my mom and my mom-in-law and my sister. I want everybody there. And the hospital wasn't prepared for that. The hospital would say, you can bring one or maybe two people. Right. And so for my doula interlocutors, part of their job was like, how do we speak back to this logic that only two people should be at a birth? Right. Why do we think that? Why do we think that birth is a private affair? When for certain communities, it's not private at all. It's communal, it's collective. So I think those conversations have been very much part of what I hear Black or majority Black audiences wanting to think through. And then I think, I hear this a lot, and as academics, it's like, it's a question that I don't know how to answer, but folks will say to me, since you wrote the book, there's been so much attention to Black mothers and nothing's changed. What's gonna make things change? And I'm like, well, that's sort of precisely the conundrum that this book is trying to think about. And I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that the investment in the expert class that has been created has not resolved the problem at all, right? And so I try to talk to folks about, for example, like the logics of the hospital as part of the problem that we might want to think through, which are not unlike the logics of the public school or the logics of the prison. Like, how do we think about hospital time as a thing that really works to inflict violence on birthing people generally and Black birthing people more specifically? But I think folks, after hearing for so long these numbers, right, like numbers about racial disparity, are like, so what do we do? Right?
And I mean, that's kind of the crazy point of it, right? That what brings us to this moment of crisis are the racial disparities.
Right.
But the sheer numbers of maternal mortality is highly problematic.
Yes.
Right. Regardless of what your race is in this country.
Absolutely. And it's funny, as I mentioned, I'm teaching this class on motherhood this semester, and one of the questions that I always throw at my students is, how do we want to understand what pregnancy is? We know it's not a time of unwellness inherently. For some people it is.
It's not a sickness.
It's not a sickness, right? And so it's strange. It's one of the few times in life where you're not unwell and you find yourself in a hospital. Right. So that's unusual. Yeah. But I'm not willing to say that it's not a medical event. So some of my students will say, well, maybe birth is just an emotional event. And I always push back and I say, truth be told, a lot of people die giving birth. Right. It is a highly risky affair. Like Sophie Lewis.
Both mothers and children.
Mothers and children. Sophie Lewis always says, it's a wonder we let fetuses inside of us, right? It's a really dangerous labor. And the work of feminists has always, pre-1980, let's say, was to say, we need to take birth seriously. We need to recognize it's deathly. I don't think it should happen in living rooms. I think it should happen in the hospital. Right. That's the mark of taking it seriously. And now we find ourselves in a moment where we're like, right, the hospital is killing us. Maybe we should go back to the living room. So I think it is really important, I often would say this to doulas, to midwives, to remember just like birth is an incredibly risky affair. And so much about birth is shrouded in secrecy and silence and mystery writ large, right? Like many people have never seen a birth until they're pregnant and see a birthing video and they're like, oh my goodness, right?
And so much of our understanding of it via popular culture is some husband, sitting in a room waiting to get the news.
Waiting to get the news, which is also so interesting because doulas would often say to me, one of the key tasks that they see themselves doing when they're serving heterosexual clients is teaching men how to be involved. Because they're like, one of the things that you realize is often men don't know how to comfort their partners. And so saying to a man like, hey, her back is hurting. Here's what you can do. Here's a pressure point. Don't sit in the corner, read the newspaper. Come closer, right? And that there's something about the structure of the hospital that has for generations encouraged men to sit in the waiting room reading the newspaper, right? I mean, when my father talks about my birth, he's like, I looked up from the New York Times and you were there, right? And that was fine. And so it's also really interesting to think about part of doula's labor is saying to men like, hey, you need to be involved here. Like this is a partnership.
And that's an important intervention, right? Because I think that sitting in the corner mentality extends to child rearing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I have distinct memories, both my daughters going to daycare and the lack of information I was provided with in terms of their day. Yet if my wife comes with me, right, it's a whole 2-hour conversation.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the presumption that fathers are not going to do anything, right?
Or they're not invested.
They're not invested, alongside the incredible demands placed on mothers writ large, right? Like kind of ideologies of intensive mothering, produce conditions that are unlivable for people, right? Yeah.
I started thinking about the book as I navigated life as a Black perinatal subject. And indeed, my curiosity about the hospital, the birthing center, the obstetrician, the midwife, the doula, and the lactation consultant, alongside my interest in the categories I found myself inhabiting and resisting: prenatal subject, postpartum subject, patient, mother, breastfeeder, consumer in the marketplace that undergirds the feminist birth industry. All of this launched the early inquiries that became this book. When this project began, I wanted to think about how my body was managed and surveilled in a moment where institutionalized medicine was newly aware of an old problem, the Black maternal health crisis. And Wylan, as you were talking, I realized I was also really interested in this, is sort of where the book ends, and what it meant to have to perform a certain kind of good Black motherhood by always being on guard, right? And this idea of like, I'm going to the doctor's office and I've read the studies and I know about weathering and I know about obstetric racism, and that's actually folded into the construction of good Black maternal subjectivity now.
When I look at your productivity over the years, it strikes me that you didn't write these books cut and dry. As in, there was one project, you were done, let me move on. It feels like there's a through line to all of your projects.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's nothing that I'm going to write that's not a Black feminist project.
Yeah, I get that.
Right. So so there's that, and there's a set of fundamental preoccupations. I mean, you know, when you've written a body of work and you go look at your work and you're like, I'm obsessed with the same stuff.
This,
like these are the questions that make me tick. And so I think there's that. This book for me was different in the sense that I started using social science methods, which I hadn't really done before. I decided to talk to people, which my first two books, which were like really theory projects, I didn't talk to anyone.
I mean, what's your training in?
So my PhD is in Black Studies, but I did it at Harvard, where you had to do a primary field. So my primary field was sociology. So I mean, I did take qualitative methods, but I never really thought of it as part of my toolkit. And then I sort of got to a point as an academic where I thought, well, I can't just pick up qualitative methods. I mean, that's not how it works. And then I thought, well, why not, right? Why not try it? Because I felt, at the time that I wrote the book, I felt like there was an opacity to the world of doulas. I couldn't quite understand their worldview and their politics unless I sat down and talked to them. I could speculate, but I couldn't understand. And the interviews opened up so much for me and moved the project in directions that I didn't anticipate. And I think for me as a scholar, it was liberating to see that I can try new methods, that I can be experimental, that my starting point for my work can explicitly be about my experience rather than back in the day where I would hide that, right? So for me, this project opened up a lot.
The image on the cover, was that a battle or?
This image, so no, this is Lakeisha Cahill's photograph. I found her randomly. She did a photo shoot for a Birmingham, Alabama group of Black mothers who wanted to be photographed breastfeeding. And I thought the image was really striking. The image got a lot of coverage. And so I reached out to Lakeisha and asked her if she would talk to me. And when I talked to her, she was awesome. She is a completely self-trained photographer.
Oh, wow.
Who had been taking kind of wedding photographs and then really got interested in breastfeeding and Black maternal health and started just taking photographs of Black women breastfeeding. She had done some birth photographs. She started to get commissions from Black folks who wanted their images taken. And she said to me, it was so fascinating, she was like, I live in Birmingham, Alabama. She said, we are the most backwards place in the country, her quote. And she really wanted to think about what it meant to be doing the work that she was doing in the context of the US South and for Black women to be organizing against obstetric violence in the context of Alabama. And so I just fell in love with her work and I was really interested in her project. And so when I was talking to the folks at Duke University Press, they were like, well, wouldn't it be obvious to put her work on your cover? And I said, yeah, it would be amazing. So I'm really honored that it's there.
The conversations about representation have changed. I can remember back in the day, Demi Moore, right, as her pregnant self on the cover of magazine.
Absolutely.
Right? We see Serena later. And there seems to be almost an explosion. You go to Instagram, right?
Yeah.
An explosion of expected Black mothers,
Yes.
stylized posing,
Yes.
right? And it really is an intervention into the way that we think about Black women's bodies,
Yes.
the way that we think about birthing mothers. What do you think that is driving that need?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I think you're right. There's this proliferation of imagery where Black mothers are. I mean, I think of Beyonce when she's wearing that crown and she's got
Right.
her pregnant belly and she's sort of like the earth mother. She's all of our
Yes.
mothers. Her Black maternal practice and body is like sacred, right? I'm thinking about how utterly gorgeous all of these women are, like Rihanna performing
Right.
pregnant, right? They're powerful and sexy and pregnant. And so suddenly pregnancy becomes this time that's like, it used to be constructed as a really asexual time.
Right.
It's not completely asexual anymore. It's powerful. It's not a time of weakness, right? It's not a time of vulnerability. And so I think there's something really interesting about how all of that has changed. And also that pregnancy is not entirely private, right? You can also think, as I was saying, how much of pregnancy and labor is shrouded in secrecy. But this idea of like you can expose your pregnant belly, right? So I find all of that.
You can buy clothes that expose.
Exactly. You can buy clothes that expose your pregnant body. You can work while you can perform while pregnant. That's really different. So I think there's this really interesting desire to sort of like consume the eroticized Black pregnant body, right? The glamorous Black pregnant body. And I also think there are things that we still can't talk about. I mean, I think Beyonce started a conversation about miscarriage. I think Michelle Obama also started, right? Like, and yet those things still happen kind of off screen, right? We can talk about Black maternal loss when it's about my son was killed by the police, but it's much harder to talk about Black maternal loss when we're thinking about miscarriage or stillborns, right? It's like somehow that's not part of the cultural frame. It's not part of the cultural frame of Black maternal death. But I do think there's this appetite to see Black pregnant bodies, and I think Instagram has only fueled that appetite.
What's next for you, Jennifer?
So I have a book coming out next August. Yeah, you laugh. You're like this. I have a book coming out next August called How We Write Now, Living with Black Feminist Theory. That's about how Black feminists kind of have constructed a new style of writing that I want to think of as beautiful. And I'm arguing that Black feminists have mobilized a beautiful style to write about what I think is our central preoccupation, which is loss. So it's a book that thinks about Christina Sharp and Elizabeth Alexander, Imani Perry, Nicole Fleetwood, a cluster of amazing folks. Amazing folks. To think about the voice that they've forged. And I think it's a voice that's both, speaking to folks in the academy, but that's also a public-facing voice. And so I'm really interested in how, I think as a kind of national sense, a cultural sense, that when we want to talk about or think about loss, Black women are the people who speak it for us.
We've been joined today by Professor Jennifer C. Nash, the Gino Parr Distinguished Professor of Women and Gender Studies here at Duke University. Talked to her about her most recent book, Birthing Black Mothers. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything.